If that happens, I would say this. Ubuntu has always been bigger than Ubuntu Desktop, if you know what I mean. So we have Kubuntu, we have Lubuntu, we have Xubuntu, the XFCE-based interface. And there will always be a home for pure GNOME, essentially, or as close as we can come to that, inside the Ubuntu archives. I would hope that developers and GNOME users can always get that experience within Ubuntu. So I know that this is being characterized as a decision to sort of drop GNOME and move off in a different direction. That's simply not, how it came about, or what our intent was, or potentially what the future looks like either. Essentially, though, it was probably presumptuous of me and of us, the Unity team, to think that we could assume that GNOME would embrace our work just because that had happened before. And now we find ourselves in this interesting position. It was
also may be worthy because I'm trying to get Unity to Debian, and it might be worthy noting that GNOME is starting to be the platform that is by developer for developer, and Unity can actually bring it to new masses. So that's the thing I wanted to add.
Yeah, we are seeing very encouraging signs of Unity being packaged for Debian, for OpenSUSE, for Fedora as well. We very much would encourage that. It's free software for a reason. You had a question over here.
Yeah, you spoke about business models and how it creates such a slim line for most companies to actually make any money. But why don't we see more of this happening in the public sector? I'm curious if these business models or profit margins are not such a concern for the public sector. Why don't we see open source?
So the question is, why are we not seeing more adoption of open source in the public sector? The answer is twofold. First, the public sector is adopting open source and very rapidly. We've seen the largest deployments of Ubuntu typically being public sector deployments. In some cases, hundreds of thousands of machines going to FreeSoft, going to Ubuntu. Typically starting in places like education, but also moving to other services, security services, and sort of administrative services as well. The handbrakes are first compatibility with Microsoft Office and other proprietary tools. And this is why I think it's important that we realize that if we actually want to be more relevant to a wider audience, we have to be more tolerant and more willing to be interoperable, right? Because we'll make faster progress that way, right? It's not about helping the bad guys, it's about smoothing the path of adoption of our stuff in places where it's not good or bad, it's just software, right? The other issue, of course, is that there are very deep relationships between buyers and sellers. It takes time for new entrants that are selling new stuff, essentially, to enter that. But we have seen very encouraging signs. The economics of free software are much better for users, both industrial users and government users. Economic pressures in Europe, for example, have led to an acceleration of adoption of open source software, which is really encouraging. Interestingly, government usage is being led in Europe, whereas corporate usage of free software is being led from the States. Yeah.
I think there is one thing that is extremely important here in Europe, and that is interoperability is one thing, but basing it on technical standards from Microsoft, for example, does not really work, which is why anyone who is pushing for more open standards and everybody feeding the risk, especially coming from the US, when it comes to software patents and intellectual property rights, especially if you talk about Google Android. Android has now 14 court cases against patent infringement, etc. Now, certain part of me thinks it's a good thing that they have the software. Another part of me thinks it's bad for software. So what's your take on this whole intellectual property?
Right. So the observational question was about the risks of trying to be compatible with a hostile de facto standard, particularly the Office format standard. I think everyone was pretty disgusted by the way in which Microsoft handled the international standards process around their own file formats and hostility towards an open standard. Nevertheless, in Europe, for example, we see quite widespread recognition of open data formats as being an important issue, and some constructive presence. I think the interoperability story is probably getting better just because Microsoft's ability to innovate against its own legacy is slowing down. Right? They can't isolate their own legacy users, and we should play that. I think we should aim for interoperability, even though it's a difficult goal. On the intellectual property front, I do see software patents as a massive source of friction and essentially a threat to not just to free software, but to the opportunities that free software presents for the rest of the world. Patents, historically, if you go back a couple of hundred years, businesses would keep secrets. So you have the glass blowers in Venice who kept as a trade secret how they would make that glass. And glass would get shipped across the Adriatic here. It would be a precious commodity because no one knew how they could make it. These ships would come over with this amazing glass and no one could figure out how to make it. So you have families that for generations would keep secrets. And the idea of patents was actually to accelerate innovation. Right? The problem for a family that had a trade secret was that all it took was one person to talk or one person to reverse engineer it, and now suddenly you'd completely lost your competitive advantage. So you were always unsure about where you stood. So patents were introduced as a way of saying, well, let's give companies the reassurance of companies, families, whatever, the reassurance of a monopoly for a while, in exchange for the disclosure. Because, as we know from academia, when one scientist has an idea and publishes a paper, and completely different scientists will often see that idea and then take it a step further. And that's very healthy, that's very vibrant. So patents essentially are a way of getting these secrets out into the open and providing compensation to the people whose secrets they were. And that actually works quite well in fields where you can keep secrets, right? It speeds things up for society in places where you can keep secrets. The problem is that today, we've gotten carried away, and so we keep trying to extend patents to things that you couldn't keep secret. And we should go back, I think, to remember the original idea. The original idea is about accelerating the benefits of knowledge and science to all of society. Well, science will happen regardless. People do research because they're solving problems that are in front of them. And that happens regardless. It's not the existence of patents that makes people do science and makes people do research. So what we should do is we should make sure that we don't allow patents on anything that you couldn't realistically keep a secret. And software is one of those things. There are lots of other things, mathematical formulas and so on and so forth. We should never, business processes, we should never allow patents on that. They just slow society down. And as you say, the level of patent hostility towards Android is a sign of how the old industries are trying to stop change. We see the same thing in the music industry, where the old middlemen who are no longer needed. You don't need a record company either to make music or to sell music or to listen to music. There's no distribution that can beat the internet. So we always see this. You see old companies trying to use intellectual property rules to slow down change in an industry, and we shouldn't stand for that yet. There are some countries that are starting to say, for example, that patents don't apply to open source software, or patents can't be used against open source software, on the basis that patents are an argument about public good, and the view is that open source is a better public good than a patent. So I think we will start to see some movement in that regard, but it's worth fighting for. We can't take it for granted. Any other questions? Yeah.
Can you tell us something about plans for supporting alternative architectures?
So the question is about plans for supporting alternative architectures. Historically, Linux has supported lots of architectures quite well. I think Debian supported 13 They may have dropped some recently, but at one stage Debian ran on 13 architectures, which is incredible. About 12. And I think that's one of the great strengths of free software. In order to provide support at the level that, say, Ubuntu or Red Hat are supported, there's quite a substantial amount of cost. So relatively few architectures, I think, can support that level of investment. Historically, x86 obviously has. I think we're starting to see ARM, certainly for sort of client devices, but possibly also for the server. We're starting to see ARM as an architecture get to the point where there's enough Linux on ARM happening now that potentially you'll see ARM become more formally supported. And I wouldn't be surprised if other, some of the big old architectures make a comeback, because that's the nature of life. You see, things go in circles, and so perhaps some other architectures make a comeback as well. But I have no specific, news in that regard.
I'd like to hear your opinion about this business model survey. Basically, I have this feeling that generally in open source, it's quite a scalable business model. Traditional open source business models like this, crazy, you don't make 10 times as much money, 10 times as many people.
Right.
So, apart from advertising that you mentioned, we think there was some later.
So the question is about business models associated with open source, and the observation, which I think is very astute, is that things like support are very difficult to scale. It's difficult to scale up when the business is growing because you've got to hire people at a time usually when everybody else is trying to hire people, and then when you have a recession or when your business gets hit, you have to scale down, and letting people go is even more difficult than hiring them in the first place. So I think that's a very astute observation. I think the internet allows us to look at service business models that don't necessarily scale as badly as traditional professional services, professional support services did. You don't necessarily have to send someone in a suit out to a customer, to bill for those extra services. So companies, like Dell, are experimenting with entering into the services game, providing professional services, but doing it on a remote basis. And based on their knowledge of the hardware and the software, and configuration and so on. And I think that really is the key, is looking for service business models which scale if we want to go beyond advertising. There are other business models that are obviously more device-oriented. Apple sells quite a lot of devices with free software kernels and so on, right? Their business model is much more tightly tied on the one hand to the hardware, and on the other hand to services like iTunes, which scales. iTunes is not free software, but it's, I guess it is partner, would be I don't know if that's an expression, unpaid. And so that suggests that there are possibilities in that regard as well. It will be difficult. There will be experimentation around that. I don't think we'll like all of it, but at the end of the day, I think if we want free software to grow, we'll need to find ways to channel investment to it. The current model for free software for GNU Linux is quite weak. Currently, because it's very difficult if you're a buyer of something that's part of the GNU Linux stack. For example, if you really want Apache, or you really want telepathy or LibreOffice, that's what your key requirement is. It's quite difficult to actually build a relationship with that project. Projects are very weak institutionally, right? You can't have a sales conversation with them. You can't have a legal conversation with them. It's difficult. You can have a legal conversation with them if you want to talk about the differences between BSD and GPL, or GPL2 and GPLv3. That's the extent of the legal conversations we can do, right? We can't have legal conversations about jurisdictions and assurances and service levels and payment terms, right? So as a result, because the components are weak, the aggregators are strong. So if you think about it, the money in open source today in the GNU world goes to the distributions. So it goes to Red Hat, Novell, Canonical, mostly, right? I think that's not very good. And it's strange that I would say that because Canonical is growing as an aggregator. It's growing as an aggregator in scope and scale and stature, and therefore its revenues will grow. The problem is if all the money comes into just a few gates and those companies then decide where they will place the investments on the back end, you don't have a lot of creativity. You don't have a lot of innovation. There's only so much innovation any one company can produce because ideas compete for oxygen internally, right? We've seen this at Microsoft. So I don't think a world where all the power rests with the distributions is very good for free software at all. And I know it's weird for me to say that because Canonical is a distribution. But I'm looking beyond the current status of free software. And I say, right, if we want to compete with Android, compete with iOS, compete with Windows, compete with macOS, we need a whole ecosystem that is as powerful and as innovative as their ecosystems. Their ecosystems have a lot of powerful entities other than the anchor tenants, right? Other than Microsoft, other than Apple, other than Google. So that's why I believe that we should encourage companies to own pieces of free software because it will channel more resources to those components, create more competition between the companies and the components. The net effect will be that the distributions get better because the components get better. The distributions get a little weaker as a result. Now, that's obviously not a popular view amongst the distributions, right? Because why would you do that? But if you look beyond the success today, I think we need to have strong companies. I'd like to see a company behind LibreOffice, right? We had one in OpenOffice, and I think we shot ourselves in the foot a little bit. But I think it would be good if companies that want to deploy free software on 10,000 desktops, not because they want an open source operating system, but because they actually want open source word processing, if they could get that directly from the company. And so I think, in fact, we've made a miscalculation in a lot of our ideology and dogma in the free software community. Yeah.
You mentioned earlier large-scale deployments in the public sector in tens or hundreds of thousands of machines. Could you name a few and in short give a couple of key preconditions to see that happen more often?
Sure. So examples of large-scale deployments, the very well-known ones in Spain, I think 7 out of 9 provinces use open source exclusively for all of their educational infrastructure. So every school has computer laboratories, they're all running GNU Linux. I think 7 of the 9 are based on Ubuntu, 1 is based on Debian, and Extremoduro. And then 1 is different, and I'm not sure exactly what they do. Macedonia just deployed, I think, 120,000 seats. They did a clever thing. They had, I think, 30,000 computers, but they used technology to put multiple keyboards and monitors around one computer so they could get very, very low cost computing. The average cost per seat incredibly low in Macedonia. France, the police force in France has moved almost entirely now to free software. That was a 7-year project. It started out with Firefox and OpenOffice, and then moved to, I think, Mail, and then they started moving the operating system. So, again, recognizing that for large institutions, these migrations will take years, and for most of that time, they will actually be in a hybrid environment. I think that's very important to realize. Munich, the famous migration in Munich, really struggled because they set a very aggressive schedule. They said, we're just going to move everything, and we're going to build our own desktop operating system in the process. That clearly wasn't an effective plan because it's taken them sort of 8 or 9 years. But they are now, I believe, making progress. They're using Ubuntu, and then they've got their own layer on top of that. So, oh gosh, what are other examples? Really? Well, Bosnia after DevConf, we're going to have, 1,000 Debian hackers in Bosnia. We can change the world. So those are scale. In India right now, there's a pilot of 4,000 that looks like it will go to a deployment of 110,000. That's a government project. So very large scale deployments.
Could I just remind you about the second part of the question?
Oh, sure, sorry.
What the preconditions for such deployments are?
What the preconditions?
Yes, what are the factors that contribute to help make that happen?
Right. So the things that those sorts of deployments depend on, first they depend on an economic advantage. So they need to become comfortable with the idea that in fact this is going to save them money, genuinely and measurably. They also often depend on manageability and security advantage. They need to sort of believe that by doing this they make their infrastructure more resilient and more manageable, so that they can spend less time fighting fires and more time adding value, adding applications. They're often dependent or associated with the move to the web. So those institutions are leaving their internal software from Visual Basic on Windows or .NET to the web, where they're delivering software through the web, and so that makes the transition easier. Those are sort of common patterns in all of those. There are many problems in the free software stack today for those institutions. Those large deployments, they have to solve a lot of interesting problems along the way. The software that we have is limited in many regards. The ability to lock down desktops, the ability to specify desktop configurations within certain ranges, to handle authentication in a heterogeneous environment is always challenging. And solving those problems, as we solve them for each user, the barriers to entry become lower elsewhere. It's going to be very interesting. The future may be the future. It's very interesting if I look at the competition for GNU Linux on the desktop. The two major challenges, I think, both come from Google. I admire Google greatly, and it is an interesting relationship that we have with them. Android could well become more of a desktop environment, and Chrome OS, obviously, putting everything in the browser. I'm a little daunted at the prospect of a world where Google literally knows everything, any data you create, any history that you create. But I think that would be a very efficient world from a manageability point of view. So it's going to have its economic advantages as well. And I think that this is the sort of competition that stimulates investment. Can we, in GNU Linux, deliver the benefits of that lightweight computing experience without some of the risks associated with the centralization of so much data? Much as I admire and respect it. Question of that?
You mentioned several times competing with Android. Do you see Ubuntu on ARM as a replacement for the Android OS, or shipping with the ARM hardware as a new installation?
So we see some very interesting. Android has its strengths. The Android team have done a very good job, targeting the form factors that they've targeted. Clearly, there's no effective competition based on Ubuntu or GNU Linux, if you want to generalize it, for the phone form factor or for the tablet form factor at this stage. We have, in GNU Linux, we have to think, there are a lot of problems for us to solve if we want to be relevant there. We have to solve problems around power management. We have to solve problems around security. We have to solve problems around user experience. We have to solve problems around footprint, the size of the image and the sort of update model experience. I think those problems are solvable, and there are lots of companies working on them. We are starting to see interesting hybrid environments. There's a phone, for example, called Motorola Apex, which has both Android and Ubuntu on it. And when you dock it team which is partly Canonical, partly ARM, and partly other people in the ARM industry. And they're doing a lot of work around both the GNU Linux stack and the Android stack. So it's very difficult to predict what might come out of that. You're creating a space where there's a lot of focused attention around both stacks, and then you look for opportunities that come from that. There isn't anything immediately obvious yet, but I always find that cultures and countries and nations and cities that are at intersection points always seem to be very vibrant places, right? It's always interesting to go to a city which has the most immigrants, because that's the city where you get the most diversity of everything, really. And so I think of that project as essentially that. It's like a crucible bringing together these different worlds of GNU Linux and Android.
Regarding it is something possible to also buy open text. Is there some collaboration between different distributions to create a common text or some label, so that also open source project gain some, because it's really hard for open source project to get donations and...
Right. So the question is about, again, business models around open source software, and specifically app stores and cross-distribution compatibility. So I think some really interesting points here. First, I think we can learn a lot from the app store. That's the first thing. It's irritating sometimes to be asked, I don't know what it would be like, 20 kuna or 30 kuna for a piece of software. But the flip side is, it's generated a lot of investment, it's created a lot of opportunities for small developers. If you look at the software industry, in the rest of the software industry, we've seen this consolidation, so you have these big companies buying up more and more software. So software is owned by fewer and fewer companies. And then if you look at the App Store world, you've got hundreds, thousands of very small development shops generating a lot of innovation, a lot of ideas, a lot of beautiful software. So I think there's lots that we can learn from that. In Ubuntu, we have something called the Software Center, which is essentially an app store. We do publish software in there. At the moment, you can buy proprietary software, and I think you will be able to donate to the projects that make free software, which is something that we've wanted to have for a long time, and now we'll have a very direct ability for people to say, I'm using this software. We'll need to do some work so that you can see which software you use the most and say, okay, I want to donate to that. But I feel very good that we'll have that capability. There are discussions about doing that, creating that across multiple distributions. The challenges, and I think it's possible, the challenges there come in things like packaging formats, which differ. I think they differ needlessly. 10 years ago, there was reasonable competition and innovation happening around packaging formats. There isn't really today. Certainly nothing that warrants the level of fragmentation that we do have. So that's one set of problems we have. You've already get packaging right. Again, we'll have to come back, I think, and solve the cadence problem. I think all the distributions should sit down every 6 months and say, okay, this is the kernel we'll use, this is the X we'll use, this is, and go through the stack. And if we do that predictably, we get to the point where we're essentially running the same stack down to the point version from top to bottom. Now that's a terrifying thought for some distributions, because they say, well, our ability to innovate or our ability to differentiate will be destroyed. I don't think that's the case at all. I don't think any significant number of people choose a distribution because of the point version of libxml that they use. But that point version difference can make a huge difference for developers targeting GNU Linux. From our perspective, we're humble about this. We don't care. We'd much rather be collaborating around a common version than trying to differentiate on point releases. And traditionally, Ubuntu has been the beneficiary of that because we have this faster release cycle, right? Typically, we have newer versions of stuff. But in fact, we'd be quite happy to collaborate with others. Debian, we've long offered to get into a release cadence with Debian, and of course the other distros as well. If you get all of those things right, then potentially we could get to a point where a developer can simply target a standard GNU Linux and deliver the software through a standard app store. Now, a more controversial question is what should be the case for free software that is available only for money in an app store. Now, that sounds shocking because we associate so strongly the free of charge piece with the freedom piece. You know, we always find ourselves having to say, it's not just free of charge, it's this. We take a free of charge piece for granted. Imagine flipping that around. And this exact example came up in the Apple App Store, where developers published GPL software into the Apple App Store. In fact, in a way that is compliant with GPL, because you can still get the source code, and you can participate and contribute. It created a storm of controversy. And I think this is one of the things where we need to be honest with ourselves. You know, when we say it's all about freedom, not about free of charge, we need to be willing to stand by that in the cases where, in fact, it could be different. We have no plans in Ubuntu to charge for GPL applications. But this is the sort of thing I think we should be willing to explore and not have a knee-jerk reaction against. In that case, I think it was Battle for Reznov. It's a really interesting game. And I don't know what the resolution of that is. I don't know whether Apple kicked it out because they didn't want the fight or what the story was. But for a while, it looked like, in fact, we would have a viable model for channeling quite a lot of funds to an open source project, which for developers was so a very interesting dynamic. And again, the sort of thing that can easily generate vicious knee-jerk reactions, but should actually stimulate us to think about what's ultimately best, and potentially to be willing to let that experiment run for a while. Question?
I have a question actually concerning the user base that is growing. So, what if when the user base grows from, let's say, several million users to several tens of millions of users, hundreds of millions of users, how does that change Ubuntu and how does it change Canonical?
So the question is about scale, about how we can deal with scale if we go from millions of users to tens and hundreds of millions of users. In order to do that, we have to change some of our practices, particularly around quality. We can't have the same relationship with 100 million users as we do with 1 million users. That's absolutely clear. And we can't deliver the same product either. So there'll be some people in that initial million who feel let down, right? But I think the cause of free software is enhanced if we're willing to try to make that transition. And ultimately, again, even the most hardcore developers that I know are not interested in developing every piece of their system equally. They actually want a consumer-grade free software platform. And then they want the ability to put today's Apache on it, or today's kernel, or today's whatever they're interested in, right? And that's where I think we can get. Maybe we can take one last question, because I know regional offices are important and necessary. I think they can help if your goal is to engage, for example, with local businesses or with government. Again, my view of the future is a little bit different. It's not so much based on the view of the past. I don't think that in the future Canonical will be of the scale of an Oracle and have lots of offices and lots of places and have to. In fact, I'd much rather that there were local businesses that were serving the local market and doing so in a way that is probably better than a global company can. We need to figure out how to make how to make Canonical sustainable. It doesn't make money today, and so figuring out the relationship between local and global is interesting. But I'd much rather that you're creating competence and expertise locally. In some cases, we've seen places where, for example, we have local companies that have taken Ubuntu and then they paint over it, they change the name and they call it, local Linux. And I think that's okay. As a starting point, it helps them get up over the ramp. It then becomes very difficult for them to grow beyond a certain point because beyond an initial core audience, people are very aware of that whole dynamic and actually want Ubuntu. So we don't discourage that because our experience is that usually helps companies get to the point where they can establish local relationships and so on. And then sooner or later you start talking to them about some sort of commercial relationship. And they realize that they're better off being able to offer a global solution. If you Google for how to make Ubuntu with local Linux X, you may not get an answer. Whereas Googling for getting a solution for that with Red Hat or with Ubuntu or with Debian, you're more likely to get a solution, particularly with Ubuntu. Anyway, thank you very much. It was
Ladies and gentlemen.